If I were to ask you what kind of government is the United States, a few different answers might come into your mind. So you might say that the United States is a democracy. You might instead say that it is a republic. And you might even go as far as to say that the United States is a democratic republic. And while these are all good answers, they are all also incorrect. In reality, the most accurate description of the United States government is a constitutional federal republic. But what does it mean to be a constitutional federal republic? Well, let's break it down. First, what does it mean to be constitutional? And in the context of the United States, at least, the term constitutional has two meanings. First, that the government is one of limited powers, and in particular, limited powers in that it must respect the civil rights of its citizens. But number two is that there is a separation of powers between branches of government. A constitutional republic means that the government has limited powers, particularly with respect to the civil rights of its citizens, and that those limited powers are separated between branches of government. And so the United States government has a constitution which structures the government and divides the powers between three branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And this separation of powers means that the legislative branch has the power to make law, the executive branch has the power to enforce law, and the judicial branch has the power to interpret law. And this scheme of separating powers between branches of government is sometimes referred to as a horizontal separation of powers. And so, if this is called a horizontal separation of powers, you are probably able to guess that there is something called a vertical separation of powers. And the vertical separation of powers falls under the ambit of being a federal republic. So, what does federal mean? Federal means that there is a separation of powers between levels of government. And in the United States, these levels are referred to as the federal government and the state government. And again, this is sometimes referred to as a vertical separation of powers. So I will attempt to draw a Venn diagram. And so this circle at the top represents the federal government, the federal level of government, and this circle on the bottom represents the state level of government. And so in a federal republic, the Constitution divides powers between the federal government and the state government. And by virtue of that, you have some powers that are exclusive to the federal government and some powers that are exclusive to the states. And a good example of these, for the federal government, the power to declare war is an exclusive power of the federal level of government. In other words, the states do not have the power to declare war on foreign nations. That is a power that only the federal government can exercise. States also have certain exclusive powers, and one of the quintessential exclusive powers of the state is the power to regulate marriage. For the most part, only the state can regulate marriage, and the federal government is not permitted to. However, the list of exclusive powers between the federal level of government and the state level of government is fairly narrow, and there is a large swath of powers that are known as concurrent powers. And these are powers that can be exercised by either the federal government or the state government. The one caveat to this, however, is that if the federal government decides to exercise concurrent powers, it will override any attempt by the state to exercise powers to the contrary. So, in general, at any point in time, either the state or the federal government can exercise concurrent powers, but if the federal government exercises them, then the state cannot interfere. Now that we have talked about the levels of government and the branches of government, let's make a table. So we have the federal level of government and the state level of government. And each of these has branches of government, including a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. At the federal level of government, the legislative branch is known as the U.S. Congress. Every state also has a legislative branch. The state governments are simply a mirror image of the federal government. In the state of Washington, there is a state legislature. Some states call their legislative body something different. Some call it a state assembly, some call it a general assembly, but every state has a legislative body. The federal government also has an executive branch, which is, of course, the U.S. President, and every state has a governor as their chief executive officer. Both the federal and state levels of government also have a judicial branch. At the top of the federal judicial branch is the U.S. Supreme Court, and each state also has its own Supreme Court. In Washington, it is known as the Washington Supreme Court, but there is some variation on what other states call their highest judicial court. So these are the names of the three branches for the two levels of government. And before I had mentioned that the Constitution separates powers between these three branches so that the legislative branch has the power to make law, the executive branch has the power to enforce law, and the judicial branch has the power to interpret law. What we will find, however, is that each of these branches at each level of government participates in the lawmaking process. And so the law that comes from the legislative branch is called statutory law, which is just another word for legislation. The executive branch also participates in the lawmaking process, and the law that comes from the executive branch is known as regulatory law. And finally, the judicial branch also participates in the lawmaking process, and the law that comes from the judicial branch is known as case law. So I'm going to make a new table here that incorporates what we've gone over so far. So I have, again, the federal level of government and the state level of government. Now, both the federal and state governments have a constitution, and that constitution divides power between three branches of government, including a legislative branch that makes statutory law, an executive branch that makes regulatory law, and a judicial branch that makes case law. So if you want to find the constitutional law of the federal government, you would look at the U.S. Constitution. And each state has its own constitution. In Washington, it is simply known as the Washington Constitution. If you would like to find statutory law for the federal government, you would look at the U.S. Code. And each state has its own body of statutory law. In Washington, it is known as the Revised Code of Washington. The federal government has a body of regulatory law, which can be found in the Code of Federal Regulations. Each state also has its own body of regulatory law. In Washington, it is known as the Washington Administrative Code. Now, finally, for case law, both the federal level of government and the state level of government have a body of case law, and it is more complicated to find, and we will talk about it at another time. But Suffice to say that case law can be found in these things called case reporters.